After witnessing far too many bad takes on racial issues in America and the Black Lives Matter movement, here's my own comprehensive bad take. I'll start first with George Floyd. He should not have died. What the police officer did was terrible, and he should go to prison. Everybody agrees on that. Was it racially motivated? There isn't enough evidence to conclude such. I'd offer no, but would not be surprised to be proven wrong. The officer has since been charged with second-degree murder, which implies intent to kill. In this case, that might be hard to prove, since Floyd was caught committing a crime, high on methamphetamine, fentanyl, had corona, high blood pressure, and died not from the officer's knee, but from a heart attack. Don't be surprised when the verdict comes out that Chauvin, the police officer, is not guilty of intentionally killing the man, when the charge should have been negligent homicide, of which I would like to see him charged for. I want justice. Increasing the charge was a PR stunt for the Attorney General, to appear like he is taking the issue seriously, when it may do just the opposite. Is it just a coincidence that in these types of incidents that go viral, the black saints who are, quote, ruthlessly assassinated by law enforcement always seem to be thugs with a criminal record, who happen to be resisting arrest? Or am I racist to point that out? Cops are people. People are capable both of good and of evil. Cops specifically are in the position of power, and with power comes abuse of power. I'm split here because on one side, I'm distrustful of the government and its tendencies to become tyrannical. Yet, the purpose of government should be to ensure personal liberties. This is only possible if people who infringe on another's liberty are punished under the force of law. You cannot have liberty without justice. We need to hold police up to a higher standard, not in dealings just with black people, but for all people. This is not a racial issue, it's a policing issue. The media was silent when Duncan Lemp, a white man, was assassinated while sleeping in his bed earlier this year. The police had been given an anonymous tip months earlier, showed up at his house and opened fire into his room, killing him and wounding his girlfriend. Mainstream media refused to cover this event because he was white. The media is complicit in spreading a false narrative.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
We are concerned about troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
The peaceful protests held by libertarians and conservatives who believe stay-at-home orders were restricting personal liberty, of which it is the government's job to uphold, was demonized for spreading coronavirus. Meanwhile, for days, news outlets continually claimed the BLM protests had the constitutional right to rally and speak up against injustice, that they were largely peaceful.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not generally speaking unruly, but fires have been started, and there's a crowd that.
Hear me? Hey. Man, you better girl. Yes, I can hear you right now. I want to show you what's going on. This is an O'Reilly's Auto Parts, or it was, and it is, destroyed. The building is basically collapsed. You can hear the explosions going on inside there from whatever is inside, whether it's... Sorry, I just got hit by a rock. Then you're seeing the Tidal Max just across the street. I'm okay. I've been hit with much worse in my day. You're seeing the Tidal Max just up the street, right across, and that's another fire. And you're hearing the explosions from inside of some of those places. And then down here, there's another fire just behind me. We were standing there just moments ago. That's the auto zone that's on fire. There is a fourth fire there at the...
Sarah, I'm going to interrupt you. Sarah, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I see other rocks going into the picture there. There are obviously some really bad people near you. I want you to get to safety if you can, and we'll come back to you and get more of your excellent reporting.
No,
please,
we're okay.
For the time
that was
being,
from
there's
across the street.
Protesters walking now, but they have several cars that have sort of joined the protest as well. And it's now just sort of a merry caravan. It is worth pointing out that it has been entirely peaceful, sometimes angry, but entirely peaceful. A few people doing some graffiti. When others saw them doing the graffiti, they would shut them down, make them stop doing it. Bottle thrown, which is not uncommon. So there is some of that, but for the most part, they have been very, very peaceful. They haven't been destroying anything. They like to take it out on the media, as everybody does, but rather than yell at us and throw stuff at us, not in a mean way.
Yeah.
And we'll be fine.
There was an open letter from 12 public health officials claiming white supremacy is a lethal public health concern that predates and contributes to COVID-19. According to public health science, and you cannot debate science, rioting and torching cities is permissible because it combats racism, which is more important than the ongoing deadly widespread pandemic. It's now clear churches and conservative protests are dangerous and spread COVID, while left-wing protests are completely okay. This is a disease. Diseases do not care about your cause. All I want is some logical consistency from the media. Preferably that all protests are permissible, because it's our First Amendment right. The media even tried to make a false distinction between protesters and rioters when the two are inextricably linked. It's not a coincidence that in every city a protest occurs, so too do riots. The media perpetuates the myth of white supremacy and of white privilege. They jump to claims of racism when the evidence is not yet clear, and claim innocence of the victims when the truth is more complicated. The BLM movement ignores the truth and is based on false premises. No, I'm not talking about the slogan. Of course, everyone agrees Black Lives Matter. It's the implication of the phrase that I object to, and many others. The implication being, there are non-significant numbers of people who think that they don't. Protesters generally do not chant uncontroversial things. People say all lives matter, not because Black lives matter less, but because they agree Black lives matter, just as much as any other race's life matters. Again, BLM implies that Black lives are under existential threat in the US, and there's a vast group of people who don't care or actively persecute Black people. A disclaimer. Yes, it is everyone's right to peacefully protest. With that being said, I don't agree with the message of the protests, and neither should you. Black people are not killed disproportionately by police when compared to any other race. The 1350 statistic is relevant here. Black people make up roughly 13% of the population in the US, yet commit over 50% of all violent crimes. The stat is actually more astounding than that. Black men represent roughly 7% of the population, yet commit nearly 42%. The trend does not change when accounting for poverty. 30% of the time, the victims of these crimes are also black. For every 10,000 white crimes, 4 white men are killed by police. For every 10,000 black crimes, 3 black men are killed. This indicates the opposite of the false premise. White men are more likely to be shot by police by a significant margin. What about white supremacy? Legitimate racists in this day and age are far and few between, and everybody hates them. And white privilege? It does not exist. Biased behavior, via implicit bias, has yet to be proven at any level. Even if it did exist, there would be no way to alleviate it. I am not denying humans discriminate. It'd be impractical if we didn't. In Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, he identifies 3 separate types of discrimination. Type 1. We use it every day. You decide who you will interact with and who will be your friend and who will not. These decisions are based on individual data and behavior. It's not racist. Type 2. Overt racism. It exists, but in less than 0.003% of the US. The same cannot be true across the world. Type 3. Somewhere between 1 and 2. Discriminating on individuals based on group data. If 50% of Group X are alcoholics, and 1% of people in Group Y are, an employer may hedge their bets by employing someone from Group Y rather than X. If that's all the information that they have. There's 2 ways to fix this. The first, allow for more granular information on the individuals in question. The second, change the group data. How can we get the crime rate lower for black communities? Ensure there are fathers in the community. An individual decision. There is not a black man in America who is forced to impregnate a black woman. Individual decision-making is responsible for group disparity. The single motherhood rate in the black community has jumped from 20% to 70% since the civil rights movement. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? America was not built on racism. Slavery existed all over the world during the founding of America, and still exists in many parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East today. What was unique about America was not slavery, but the founding principles of Christian ethics and natural law. The principles, well, they were not practiced correctly by those who promoted them in theory. Those theories were valid and remain valid today. The story of America is the broadening and the application of those principles. According to statistics, America is the least racist it has ever been, and is the least racist society in the world today. It's time we stop conflating the past with the present. The notion that things were bad once, therefore they are bad now, is not a particularly strong argument. If you can find a specific racist person, behavior, act, or law, I will protest it. The idea that America is systemically racist, however, is wholly unproductive. It allows people to avoid naming specific policies and people, and instead claim the entire system is bad. Thus, we must tear down the system, effectively throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Claiming victimization of the system only robs individual capacity and demonizes the other side, white heterosexual men. White privilege is a cowardly way to shift responsibilities for your shortcomings. The reality is, some people make better decisions, and some values are better values. Perhaps equality of opportunity only exists so long as people are willing to take advantage of those opportunities. You only need to do 3 things to avoid poverty in the US. Graduate high school, get a job, don't have babies before you're married. Black culture is really bad at all three of these things when compared to any other race, even with poverty accounted for. The greatest privilege in America is not white privilege. It's being born with a two-parent family. Whether or not you have an active father is the single most important determinant for intergenerational poverty. If we really want to talk about white privilege, we have to address Asian privilege. It doesn't matter Chinese American workers were brought here and treated like slave labor. It doesn't matter Japanese Americans were interned by the hundreds of thousands during World War II. Asian Americans outperform whites in terms of both income mobility as well as wealth ownership and education. We never talk about these groups because it would invalidate the idea that America is bigoted on the basis of group identity, and validates the idea that freedom does indeed exist. Asians do better on standardized tests, and have to in order to get into university. Asians receive a penalty of minus 15 points on their average test score, while blacks receive a bonus of 235 points. In today's society, we bend over backwards to give minorities as many advantages as we can think of. If a white and a black man are equally qualified for a job, the company's diversity board will typically give the occupation to the black man. As half Hispanic myself, I've received thousands of dollars worth of scholarship just because my mother isn't white. As you may notice, accusing a racial group of privilege sounds a lot like racism. A quick aside about specific supposed racist policies. The first, let's talk about stop and frisk. In New York, 98% of gun assailants were Hispanic or black. Stop and frisk under-targeted minorities, only 85% were Hispanic or black. If there's any white privilege at all, it's that white communities are policed more than poorer minority communities. Black communities don't need fewer cops, they need more to stop the crime. This is exactly the opposite of what BLM proposes, and more people will die because of it. How about DWB, driving while black? Blacks again are disproportionately more likely to speed. They make up 13% of the population, but 25% of all speeders, and are pulled over only 23% of the time. In crack versus cocaine sentencing, crack is more addictive, easier to distribute, and the lead sponsors of the legislation were black members of government who were sick of seeing their communities become prey to the crack epidemic. 80% of crystal meth cases are of white people, and the sentencing is identical to that of crack. The idea that prisons are overrun by minorities for drug-related crimes is not true. Only 3.6% are convicted for drug possession, and that's typically because a drug dealer pled their charge down from drug distribution. And voter ID laws. Certainly, those are discriminatory. According to the left, voter ID suppresses minority voter turnout. It is, therefore, blatant discrimination. There is nothing to support this leap of faith. Minorities are voting in higher numbers than ever before. The insinuation by the left and the mainstream media, but I repeat myself, is that minorities are not capable or smart enough to obtain an ID. This is the left's soft bigotry of low expectation. They infantilize minorities, treat them like children, and strip them of individual capacity. I don't want to give off the idea that I'm willing to dismiss a racist policy. These examples are not those. Conflating them as such is a false narrative perpetuated by the media. Real racist policies, they are hard to come by, because they are an evil voters across both parties refuse to support. How about white people being more likely to obtain positions of power? For this, we have to look at a very simple statistical phenomenon. Suppose we have two normal distributions. One represents the success of white people, and the other minorities. If the two are not identical, as is reality when comparing any two distinct groups, the vast majority will overlap. But when we look at the extremes, like the 95th percentile, we'll notice those people are much more likely to be from the white group than the minority group. Inequality is not inequity. As I stated before, these baseline statistical differences are not racist. They are the aggregation of individual decisions based on culture. Police have 375 million contacts with civilians every year in the US. A solid statistical analysis will prove there is no structural bias in the criminal justice system with regards to arrests, prosecution, or sentencing. Crime and suspect behavior, not race, determine police action. A total of 235 out of 30 million black people were killed by cops last year. That share is less than what crime rates would predict. 80 blacks in Chicago were killed in a drive-by shooting this weekend alone. Blacks die of homicide 8 times more than any other race because of criminal violence. The disparity we see between whites and blacks has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. By buying into these myths, you are actively driving deeper conflicts. Funny how the liberals who hate cops also want to disarm the general populace. Gun sales have doubled in the past week because of the riots. Hopefully now liberals understand why it might be necessary to own a gun with more than a 10-round clip. You have, via the Second Amendment, the absolute right to protect your life, whether it be against violent criminal rioters or a tyrannical government. The riots are the least productive event of this whole ordeal. It's evil. Theft, arson, destruction of property, murder, assault, battery have all proliferated. These are disgusting acts of evil that can never be justified. It plays into the stereotype of black people stealing and committing violent crimes. Definitely not self-aware. Definitely not a good look for the movement. The killing, assault, destruction of business has almost exclusively happened in the community where the rioters reside. They are actively harming the people whose lives they claim matter. The idea that the more outraged you are, the more angry you are, the more violent you are, the more justified you must be, is nonsense.
Come on, G. Come on, G. Come on, G. Damn, man, over some TVs, cuz. Over some TVs, man. For real. It's somebody's granddaddy, cuz. Man, fuck you, nigga. What y'all trying to do? Fuck you talking about? Y'all kill this man over some TVs, cuz. Over some TVs, cuz. You hear me? That shit we could get, cuz. Over some TVs, cuz. Stop playing, man. OG, come on, OG. Come on, OG.
You says Black Lives Matter. I worked here part-time. Plus, I'm a part owner of this store. You said Black Lives Matter. Why don't you choke me? I'm black.
Tell him, sister.
Look what you did to my store.
Tell him, sister.
Look what you did to my store.
Tell him, sister. That's right, because I got they back. These are my dudes right here. Good
look
men.
At the things you done.
Good men.
Look.
The Black Lives Matter.
We've been here all night cleaning up. All night cleaning.
And you got black people standing right here with them. Black
tell
people.
Me,
that's right.
Black Lives Matter.
Exactly.
You lied. You wanted to loot in the store. You needed money. Get a job like I do. Stop stealing. This is the neighborhood. We're trying to build it up, and you tearing it.
Major corporations for the better part of a decade have been blatantly pandering to a liberal audience. Evidence on this is more than overwhelming. Everyone remembers the Gillette ad from about a year ago. Everyone remembers last June when it was hard to find a company whose Twitter or Instagram profile wasn't rainbow colored. And now those same companies are putting on the facade of support for BLM. They don't actually support these issues. These companies are virtue signaling for the sake of profit. If, for any reason, pretending to be in support of BLM or pro-LGBTQIAA+, happened to not be profitable, said company would switch their position on a dime. In fact, they already do this. All you need to do is compare domestic marketing to marketing in places that truly oppress people, like in the Middle East and China. The hypocrisy is palpable. Human rights only matter to the companies when it's in America. I'll give you a few examples. McDonald's, Disney, Activision, Bethesda. McDonald's just a few weeks ago was banning black people from entering their stores in China for fear of coronavirus. They have the balls to post about BLM. Disney, who panders more than probably any company, posted about how they stand against racism and stand for inclusion. Worst of all, Activision, a morally bankrupt video game publisher, actively suppressing voices who call out China for their human rights abuses. A reminder, the entire cast of Overwatch, a hugely successful Activision game, is straight in the Chinese version, whereas on all the other servers they are extremely diverse in race and sexuality. Bethesda is another games publisher who recently transitioned all their social media icons to rainbow, with the exception of Bethesda Middle East. In the Middle East, may I remind you, rape, molestation, sexual mutilation, stonings, beheadings, and the execution of gay people are a daily occurrence. Some will claim the hypocrisy is warranted because the cultures abroad are not the same. Unfortunately, there are only two viewpoints that are mutually exclusive. That of the West, of free speech, of equality, and consent of the governed. The other is China's or Iran's view of suppression, state force, and human suffering. You cannot pander to both anymore. When Activision or Disney or the NBA or Apple or anyone sides with China over the US, they are siding with forced organ transplants, media suppression, rape, enslavement of Uyghur Muslims, persecution of the religious, and assassination of political opposition. China is an evil government. The West's moral cowardice in regard to China will go down in history as just as shameful as Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of the Nazi Germany before World War II. The next time any of these companies virtue signal about gay pride or BLM, the next time they attempt to rack up social goodwill in America for Women's Day or Pride Month or Black History Month, recognize you are being played. Imagine having the same politics as Burger King and Pepsi and thinking you're revolutionary or dissident. If you're white, you're in luck. You can alleviate your burden of white guilt if you admit guilt and make penance. You must acknowledge everything that made you successful as not a result of your hard work and decision making, rather, a result of your privilege. You must continually confess on your knees and beg for mercy. By acknowledging your white privilege, it makes you feel good. It makes you a better, more enlightened person compared to those who don't. The implication by the media is, if you are not doing this specific performative thing today, it is because you do not care about black lives. If you do not post that black square on Instagram, you are not in solidarity with black lives, and therefore are opposed to black lives, and therefore are a racist. The performative woke virtue signaling by white people is essentially the display of taking on sins of their ancestors. It's masturbatory self-glorification. And the religious parallels are easy to see. What they really are saying is, I am not taking on the sins of my ancestors. Those who disagree with me are to blame. The social media posts wouldn't help even if the premises were correct. Alright, this might be a cynical take, but I have a theory about some of the virtue signaling I've noticed in the past week. I believe some of the people that I follow, they understand how lazy it is to pretend their sins have been atoned for by a single post on Twitter. Those who have caught on and don't want to be ousted for slacktivism opt to go a single level deeper by publicly donating or by spreading information about how the viewer can help the movement. I understand this theory is self-defeatist. It concludes that anyone who puts in any effort at all is only in it for the social media clout, to put on the facade that they are virtuous, regardless of whether or not their motives are actually pure. But I can't help to feel like this might be the case, at least for some. I've seen plenty of posts encouraging people to go out and vote. Stop generically telling us to vote in response to all the police brutality. Yes, we should vote, but we have to be very specific. Democrats from top to bottom are running the cities with the worst police brutality in America right now. We voted for them. A higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was Republicans whose Philadelphia plan in the 70s sought to break the construction union's racial barriers that kept blacks out of skilled trades. In the words of Thomas Sowell, racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive mainly by the people who use it as an excuse or to keep minority communities fearful or resentful enough to turn out as a voting bloc on election day. Black votes matter to many politicians, much more so than black lives. Racial harmony would be a political disaster for such politicians. It's time to leave the Democrat plantation. What can you do to help? For starters, stop the spread of misinformation. The myth of white privilege and black discrimination in the U.S. is harmful and untrue. Take a second and consider all of the unjustified hurt and anger in the streets right now. If only they knew the truth. How many people would still be alive? How many would be uninjured? How many black businesses would not be in ashes? You want to end racism? In the words of Morgan Freeman, stop talking about it. I'll stop calling you a white man, and you stop calling me a black man. Now, he's not saying acts of racism should be ignored, or that racism isn't an issue. He's trying to say that we need to stop seeing people of different color as any bit superior or inferior. Stop living in this mindset where skin color defines who you are or how society should treat you. Living with the mindset that blacks are the victims and the whites are privileged only creates more racism and divide. Stop thinking that you're a victim and that the other person with different skin is privileged. Just because your ancestors were bonded in chains, or that they weren't, doesn't define who you are. And no one owes you anything, and you owe no one anything for historical injustices from the past. The best that we can do is move on and continue to treat others fairly. Thanks for watching. planting.